Hello, good afternoon and welcome. I hope you
Hi.
all had a nice lunch break and are looking forward to the panels this afternoon. I'm Mayora J. Robert and I'm a proud member of the Equality Leaders community. By way of introduction, I am a research trainee at Demos, Britain's leading cross-party think tank. I work on a diverse range of topics, including inequalities, welfare reform and local economic growth. My work predominantly involves conducting quantitative and qualitative research, shaping British public policy. Through my work as a content manager for Equality Leaders, I strive to provide a platform for voices that are often disadvantaged by actively promoting research and content from these communities, providing exposure to the many nuances we, as an inclusive society, host. So over the years, definitions of sex, gender, and sexuality have become conflated to the point where we find it difficult to distinguish and identify who or what we are. In part, it's the media's fault, but also the lack of legislation protecting minority groups and their rights. Our guest has been an advocate for LGBTQ rights for quite some time now. Originally from Indonesia, Shiva Raichandani has traveled the world and has continued to raise the roof, not just through dance, but through advocacy too. They debuted on Britain's Got Talent and brought gender fluidity to the nation's attention. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Shiva to our conference. Welcome, Shiva. It's such an honor to have you here today.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. And thank you so much for having me, to yourself and to the team that's organized this. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure.
It's honestly our pleasure. So why don't we start with a little intro to who Shiva is and what inspired you to pursue advocating for LGBTQ rights? So yeah, tell us about yourself, Shiva, and yeah, take the stage.
Always weird trying to introduce oneself, but all right, let me try. So I'm Shiva Raichandani. Again, thank you so much for having me here. I am a multidisciplinary performance artist. A lot of my work centers around dance, theater, and film. I'm non-binary, and all of my work, sort of the content that I create, uses the power of storytelling to create inclusive spaces for positive gender diverse representation in mainstream media. I have been a contestant, a semi-finalist on Britain's Got Talent, India's Got Talent, France's Got Talent. And so my work has sort of spanned various mediums. I also freelance as a consultant on inclusive LGBT plus practices for corporate organizations, charitable organizations, not-profits. I'm also a content manager at New Inclusion, which is a DE&I consultancy. Currently, I'm working on 2 film productions. One is my own production, Queer Parivar, which is a South Asian queer romance that was crowdsourced. And the other is a Netflix documentary that I've been commissioned to do around queer performers in the UK. So yeah, that's sort of I know I do a lot of things. I don't really have a specific title or job title as such, but a lot of my work spans the performing arts, specifically through the queer lens.
Gosh, yeah, and I don't know if you mentioned, but Shiva also teaches dance.
I do.
Yeah, and I've had the wonderful honor of actually attending one, and that in itself is a beautiful experience.
Oh, thank you.
And
Thank you so
it
much.
really brings me on to the next question, because one thing that Shiva does at their classes is that they talk about the importance of non-binary in the dance element. And Shiva, I think it's best to hear from you. So let's start with, what does it mean to be non-binary, and how do you bring this into your work, as I've seen you do so beautifully?
Sure. So actually the word, the label itself, non-binary, is relatively new to me myself, and it's only recently that I started using it. Having grown up in a largely conservative family, we didn't really have the vocabulary to address gender variance, or just we had a very heteronormative upbringing, very rigid binaries, and were confined into those sort of boxes. And even the art form that I practice, dance, while sort of music and dance is very inherent to our culture, the Indian culture, it is still very gendered in its nature. So you have male lyrics or female lyrics, and male choreography, female choreography, and you're sort of trying to navigate those very rigid spaces and trying to see where you fit in, whether or not you fit in, and trying to carve out your own space in it all. And so that's truly when sort of I started questioning and understanding that I don't necessarily feel comfortable in these spaces with these labels. And it's been a journey. It's been a process in trying to, again, understand what makes sense to me. And so it was only recently that since moving to the UK that I started using the word non-binary, because I feel like it truly, well, obviously it is just another label, but it helps contextualize the fact that I don't feel connected to the rigid binary of male or female, man, woman, and I sort of see myself as this expands beyond those limitations. So it's not something that I see myself as in between of or trying to fit into the binary. It's sort of rejecting the binary as a whole and existing outside of it. In this own little weird space. And I think, again, what non-binary means to me, or my experience of it, again, is very subjective and is very personal to me. And there is no monolith, or there's no template of what non-binary means or looks like. Everyone's experience of it varies. And of course, everyone's individual experiences are valid. And so everyone has their own relationship with specific labels. And so I can only speak to sort of and represent what it means to me in that sense. So I think the fear is that people with labels and stuff, people tend to group everyone's experiences as one and tend to treat everyone as a one size fits all sort of narrative. But yeah, so in general, that's how I feel about it. And sort of that then informs my practice and my work, where should anyone else feel similarly or resonate with how I approach music and dance, I'd love for them to have a safe space to do so as well. And so even in my dance classes, I ensure that everyone has that space to perform and dance in a way that feels comfortable and safe to them. I think that safety is very key.
Definitely. And, you made a brilliant point about how non-binary is something that exists outside of binary, because I've often found myself in conversations where people say, oh, but so are they more masculine or feminine? Like, are they one or the other? And it's like, no. It's like you said, outside of that, we're neither. It's you make your own identity and fit in within that non-binary. And thanks to you, Shiva, and your work, I learned that. And I hope people today do too. So you said that since you moved to the UK, you kind of started using the non-binary identity. How did you find that, and how did you continue finding it kind of navigating society as a non-binary person than prior to doing it? Because there's a lot of conversation around pronouns, for example, and the kind of associated elements with that within the workplace environment. I'm wondering, what was the shift there, and how did you approach that?
Sure. I think when it comes to labels, right, we sometimes get so fixated on holding on to a specific kind of label. I mean, we're so complex as individuals, we're so expansive in our nature, and it's hard to reduce ourselves to one specific label, because right from the moment we're born, we've got labels attached to us, right? Because we try and construct our identities in a way to help others make sense of us, but rarely do we then, I think, sit back and try and deconstruct those identifiers that we've adopted for ourselves to really understand what makes sense to us. So rather than trying to create a narrative that is palatable to the others or the outside, it's more about what makes sense to me and what does that look like. So to sort of then simplify that in my context, I was like, okay, while yes, I may not have the necessary vocabulary for things early on, but it's understanding that I don't necessarily identify with certain things that have been the norm or have been what has been prescribed in essence. And so Again, we need those cultural filters as well, right? Because having grown up in various parts of the world, in Hong Kong and Indonesia, and then in India, the way people speak about these identities varies. The way it's approached, the context in which it's talked about, it varies. And so we need to be sort of mindful of that as well, because the way we speak about it here is completely different elsewhere. And so having that understanding that you don't necessarily need to be one thing or the other, and gender is so expansive and in essence is a performance, and there's so much more beyond it. That was very comforting to know. Just the fact that one specific label can be interpreted in so many different ways shows how open and open to exploration and open to this expanse and freedom that comes with it. So that was very comforting. But of course, it's not to say that we need to completely do away with labels, because sometimes they are necessary to find communities, to find support for legislative purposes and stuff. So hence why, in sort of understanding that, okay, I probably do identify as non-binary, I was able to then find other people with similar experiences that I can fall back on for support, to learn from, because I think a lot of who I am right now is an amalgamation of various experiences and stories of other people that I've been fortunate enough to come across, or for those that have come before me. And I think they have informed how I sort of see myself and navigate the world. So I think that has helped as well. So there hasn't been a clear-cut linear sort of way. I don't think there ever is a linear way to sort of discover oneself, or because I think discovering oneself is a continuous process. You're constantly evolving, you're constantly growing, you're constantly finding newer aspects to yourself, and then growing out of some. And so that flexibility and that freedom is what we need to sort of hone in on and be comfortable with. So yeah, so for me is, I mean, I'm not the same person that I was yesterday. I'm not going to be the same person tomorrow. And so it's being okay with that and finding comfort in that growth, in evolving and changing, because change is the only constant. And so even like when sometimes people say, oh my God, you're finally living your like best life. And I'm like, I have no idea what that means, because like that could be completely different in like a few years. Like how I view non-binary like a few years ago is completely different to how I do it today. And so I think with vocabulary, with experiences, it's really personal and individualistic, and we need to just find our own space within it all. And there is no clear-cut way, there's no clear-cut template that you need to follow or should be doing in order to navigate society. But yeah, it's all down to what's comfortable and safe for you, because I think that's first and foremost safety.
Yeah, completely. And you know, you said so many brilliant things there, and I think one of the things that really chimes to me is that people often put up these walls saying that non-binary is attacking binary, but isn't. It's saying that you're welcome to identify as who you want to, just as we are as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's often a big misconception that I often find in conversations with others.
I think everyone, irrespective of how they identify in terms of gender and sexuality and stuff, just having that ability to inquire within and just have that dialogue can be very liberating. And it's not trying to say that everyone needs to be non-binary, everyone needs to be, a certain way. It's more about like there's space for everyone, however you choose to identify. And that's the whole point. There is space for everyone, and we're not gatekeeping certain identities or excluding certain identities, but having that ability to welcome one and all as is.
Yes, completely. And, it can be quite restricting to having to identify as, say, a woman, and finding liberation in identifying as non-binary, because like you said, Shiva, I sometimes like to do the male roles of Bollywood songs, because sometimes I'm just like, yeah, I want to let that energy out. But yeah, completely. The next question I have is more about workplace discrimination.
Yeah.
So non-binary individuals often experience significant rates of discrimination in the workplace. There's a statistic where it's almost a third who've experienced discrimination alone in just the hiring process.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious to know, what has this experience been like for you? And if you don't mind, like, would you share a few anecdotes, and how have workplaces taken steps to be more accommodating if they have? Or how could they have? I know that's like 3 questions in one, so
yeah. You're going to lose track, but I will try my best.
I will pop.
Don't worry. No, I mean it is actually it's very horrifying when you see the stats, and I think it's something around like 50% of non-binary people and trans people hiding their gender identity at work out of fear of being discriminated. And yes, you are right that in 1 in 3 employers don't even agree on hiring a trans person, and it's terrifying. And again, I always draw back to safety, because if we are not comfortable even stepping out of the house without being hyper aware of our safety and worrying about not being able to come back home safely at the end of the day, that's a huge problem. And then think of that in a workplace setting. If I don't feel safe entering a workspace, not knowing how or in what condition I'll be leaving that space, that's a very serious question to check and to sort of investigate of what sort of culture and what sort of environment is being created. I mean, personally, I've been policed for my transness, for my gender nonconformity in various spaces, the way I sort of express my gender. And obviously, gender again is one aspect, right? You add layers of like your intersectional, multidimensional identities and other dimensions of diversity, whether it's your race, your skin color, your ethnicity, your background, your nationality, all of these socioeconomic status, all of these things then add to that sort of compounded effect of the way you're treated. And again, marginalized in those settings. So back in the day, oh my God, right, you're right from the time of CVs, I was like, how do I de-gay my CV and ensure that there's not anything queer, there are no queer undertones to it. This was really back in the day when I was like, I really need a job and it's so hard to find one. So
I'm just here, sorry, I'm just here thinking, what on earth would even be considered queer undertones, because at the end of the day, it's just yeah.
So it's more like if you've done any work around sort of LGBT plus initiatives and that sort of stuff, or anything that might indicate an association with the queer community in any way, which is a terrible, terrible, terrible mindset to have. But it's sort of it's something that people genuinely face and have to sort of hide aspects of themselves, mask aspects of themselves, and code switch. So code switching is a big thing where you alter the way you present yourself. So for example, the pitch of your voice, trying to make it a bit more sort of lower and like masculine, and then trying to have less eye contact with people in the hopes that they don't find out that, or see you in a certain way, and then trying to ensure that your mannerisms. There was a point where, oh my God, this was back like a few years ago, where apparently people have an issue with the way people walk as well, because a colleague had pulled me aside and said, you shouldn't be walking with such a hip thrust because that could draw in the wrong kind of attention, and we don't want that. And I was like, wow, I need to be thinking about the way my hips move. Like, I've got other things to deal with, but that's another sort of thing that I need to have at the forefront of my mind. So it's sort of all these things where you're, again, as I said, you're hypersensitive and hyper aware of the way you present yourself in certain settings, because again, it's not just the exterior, right? Your clothes, your outfits. Some places have dress codes that are like very rigid, again, that conform to the binary. And then it's sort of all of these things, like the way you present yourself, that can be a problem in any given setting. So it's trying to like constantly calculate whether this action or this specific thing would put me in harm's way. And I think that's a very scary thing, because I think everyone wants to celebrate the LGBT plus community and its visibility and all of that, Pride Month and yada yada. But then that visibility comes at a cost as well, and it's very detrimental to queer folk if we're asking for their visibility, but not placing measures that protect them from sort of the harms or the other side of the ugly side of visibility.
Completely. I'm shocked, and I'm sorry that that's what's happened to you in your past. And I hope that during the progression of your career, you found more inviting and accommodating environments?
I think I've been privileged enough to try and seek out spaces that are a lot more inclusive from the ground up, that have sort of inclusion at the forefront of their mind and are built around inclusive practices inherently within the DNA of their culture. But again, not many people have that. I still find people reaching out to me asking, how do I navigate this space? How do I ensure that I'm not put in harm's way? I'm like the only LGBT person, I'm the token LGBT plus person. How do I ensure that sort of I'm not being taken advantage of, or that I'm not being hired sort of in a position that doesn't allow me to have a voice? So there are a lot of nuances sort of that are attached to being a minoritized person, in whichever way you consider minorities, but a minoritized person in a working environment where the dominant culture isn't very accommodating or inclusive.
And what is often your advice to people?
Like businesses, like in general, of like...
In this specific instance, so what can they ask their workplaces to do to be more accommodating, or where could these businesses have taken steps to avoid or completely open up their selection process so that this isn't something that you even have to think about?
Yeah. Oh my God, this goes way, way back, right? What is the intention with which you are going ahead with all of these things? Because if you're just trying to do it as a tick box exercise, then you're not really going to reach any meaningful, tangible change, sustainable even. And so that intention really matters. Trying to see your own before you hire other people's. Look at your own teams, look at the people around you that you work with. Are there queer people around you? Are there trans non-binary folk in those decision-making spaces where they can sort of effect change and bring queer talent up, mentor them, sponsor them, and sort of like create space for them? Because it has to be both ways, top down and bottom up as well, so that we're creating that culture. It's not that we're just hiring queer talent at the lower levels, but then they have no say or power on policy guidelines and what sort of shapes the company. So we need them at the top as well in order to champion sort of inclusion. And then where are the allies? Sort of what sort of allyship are we looking at? What sort of measures are in place within the company policy in itself, where you are hiring people, and not just, and I don't mean blindly hiring people, blind CVs and all that, actually see people for their queerness, for their identities, and hire them despite those identities. So obviously seeing merit, but also not discounting their queerness as part of the individual's being. And obviously, again, if you are going to bring in queer people into your space, the spaces need to be safe. So are there policies? Are there trans inclusion, non-binary inclusion policies involved? Again, you need those rights. You need protection. And so it's sort of really ensuring that throughout the culture of the company, you are having that inclusive approach. That could even literally be, again, as simple as ensuring your CV, your job adverts, right? What imageries are you using? Do your job adverts have gender diverse imageries? Is the language gender inclusive? Sort of those really, those are points that really get flagged when I'm applying for something. I can see, okay, this company has a vocal commitment to LGBT plus inclusion right on their websites and stuff. They're very vocal about it, and not just during Pride Month, but all year round. And then their job adverts aren't discriminatory in the sense that they're inclusive, they're gender inclusive, their imageries are gender inclusive. And so it makes me safe in knowing that this is someplace that I can apply to. So that's, again, at the very basic level, but then it's the ongoing daily sort of work culture that we need to monitor and ensure isn't further marginalizing people.
Yeah, completely. And what I find quite interesting there is the top-down approach, because as I understand it, I'm going to make maybe it's controversial, maybe it's far-fetched, but I would assume that FTSE 100 CEOs, like, I don't know the proportion of them that identify as non-binary, and I would imagine it's minimal, if anything. So the top-down approach, would it essentially come from allyship?
It really, so I think, sorry, just to pause there, because you brought up the point of data and collecting data. I mean, how safe is the workplace for me to disclose my transness, my
Visibility that you're
non-binary?
talking about.
And so, exactly. So
Mm.
if I know that disclosing it is not going to lead to any benefit or safety concerns, then that is an issue in itself. So yeah, but obviously, again, which is why I said, if the work environment and culture in itself isn't inherently inclusive, then it's very hard for someone to be openly themselves, authentically themselves at the workplace. And again, this again is wide ranging, right? I mean, it goes beyond just pronouns. I think people tend to like just stop at pronouns. Like the conversation constantly just ends at pronouns, and I'm like, we need to do more than just getting pronouns right. Obviously, getting pronouns right is absolutely imperative and important and should be a common practice where you're sharing it and getting it right and stuff. But then we need to be careful about confidentiality, disclosure, and outing people in case. I mean, they could be safe at work, but then outing them at work and then they're not safe at home. So there's that disconnect as well. So it's ensuring that you're not putting people at even though you may have good intentions, you don't want to put them in harm's way.
Completely. And one of the things that I didn't know until quite recently is that under the Equality Act, you know how they have 7 protected characteristics.
Yes.
Non-binary isn't actually within that.
It actually recently, so as of September 2020, non-binary has been added as a protected characteristic. But yes, the fact that it's only been added very recently, as late as 2020 September, that it shows how we need to keep catching up and keep with the times. But yes,
it was when you made that point about policy, and that's like one of the most basic things that can be done to ensure people have their rights. But yeah, moving on. So I kind of want to talk about how the pandemic has affected the LGBTQ community, especially, we know the pandemic has been a difficult time to navigate, and we are by now well aware of the mental health impacts it has had on people.
Yeah.
I mean, last year, Pride London and Black Pride were moved online. So, and then also on top of that, LGBTQ support services were reduced in capacity. And we saw countries across the world taking dangerous steps backwards against the LGBTQ community. So I'm kind of wondering, how did the pandemic affect you? And was it more difficult than pre-pandemic? Or, on the flip side, was there a silver lining to it, perhaps? What has it been like for you? And perhaps speaking on behalf of the non-binary community, were you aware of any difficulties they faced? Were they able to reach out to help?
I think we're in a very strange time, especially in the UK, where transphobia is on the rise, and discrimination against non-binary, gender non-conforming people is very much on the rise, and the rhetoric around it is absolutely vile. For me, I think because I'm also a freelance artist, that was the bigger challenge going into the pandemic and lockdown, where a lot of my work, as obviously because I work in live entertainment and film and dance and all of that, so a lot of my work was then on hold, paused, cancelled, and everything for the entire year. So that was the bigger blow. Fortunately, things are picking up right now, which is good. But with that was the loss of community, real life access to community, because I think for a lot of us queer folk, we find solace, comfort, and refuge within our communities, within sort of having those gatherings, that social aspect of a community that we then lost due to the pandemic. And a lot of us were displaced and then had different issues around work. But it was great for some of us where we were able to come together even within online spaces to just create our own jobs, create our own spaces, and platform one another with the best ways we can, because I think the work doesn't stop, right? You still have to figure out ways to do stuff, earn money, and look after one another. Obviously, staying at home behind a screen in some ways is a lot safer sometimes than walking out onto the streets and into workspaces, especially if you express your gender identity in a way that isn't very sort of palatable to the gender binary, and if you look a certain way and are sort of faced with public discrimination or violence, that can be really tough. And so sometimes finding that comfort just at home within your own space, behind a screen, was in some ways comfortable. But on the flip side of that, where people aren't in safe environments, are in hostile environments where their families aren't welcoming or accepting or just generally sort of LGBT plus inclusive, then that was the flip side, where it was a bit more dangerous for them to constantly be in their vicinity in that hostile environment. So it's a double-edged sword. But what we need to try and ensure is that as we move out of the pandemic, that we aren't losing sight of what worked and what didn't work during this time, in terms of like accessibility, in terms of safety, in terms of all of those good positive aspects. How do we can bring that into the workspaces as we transition, however we transition?
Yeah, completely. And, you know, as you say about the shift to remote working that you kind of alluded to. So
Yeah.
research has shown that, you know, disadvantaged communities or minorities are finding it more difficult to build those workplace relationships that are so integral to feeling a sense of belonging and feeling valued at work. And but then on the other hand, like you said, it is also comforting to be behind a screen because you're not then subjected to the different forms of discrimination people might face in the workplace.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering, how is it? I mean, you kind of answered already about your experience remote working, but then do you expect there to be adverse impacts on the other hand for non-binary folk? And how can businesses build an online safe space, essentially? Or what policies can they instill so that people do feel valued, that those relationships are still built and cemented despite it being remote?
I think, again, I can't speak for obviously the entire community, and I won't, but I think what would help is ensuring, again, I tend to circle back to safety a lot, because I feel like that's constantly at the forefront of mind, in whichever space I enter. So I think having whoever it is, whether you're queer or not, but that sort of ally that checks in on people is very useful. So I've found that my some of my bosses during the pandemic would reach out, would check in, have those mental health checkpoints where they're just checking in and to see, are you okay? How are you coping? Is there anything that I can do or add value or help with your work? And sort of be a bit more mindful and of the nuances and sensitivities around working online, because depending on someone's workspace at home or wherever they are, it sometimes they just can't put their video on, sometimes they can. It's just those basic things that, you know, you're allowing for it to not be policed in a certain way, and allowing people to be safe however they choose to be safe within their environment, whether it's to show videos, share pronouns on their names, and all of those small tweaks that they can do, ensuring accessibility. We had the other day people who had asked for sort of just general accessibility issues where they can't travel sometimes safely. So are you helping them with transport in that sense, or ensuring that just if they are stepping out of their safe spaces, that they're not going into more dangerous spaces, if that makes sense, and looking after that and ensuring that community is built. So whether you're investing into network groups, and funding for network groups is absolutely important, because I think having those social elements to the work environment is absolutely imperative for people to, again, as you said, find that sense of belonging, community, and camaraderie, where they can share their experiences, especially within a space where people may identify similarly, so that they can be that support system, buddy up, and find that sort of just solace in that front.
Completely. And kind of looking into, also adding to that conversation on tangible action that businesses can make, I'm kind of wondering, what are your thoughts then on allyship? Because we discussed mentorship, but I'm wondering, what can I as an ally do so that my colleague feels that this is a safe space for them. I might not identify as non-binary, but I'm going to be there to make sure that they can.
I think the biggest thing we can do is just not assume what someone's gender and gender identity is, and not sort of have that viewpoint, and then also understanding that there is no right or wrong way to express a specific gender. There's no right or wrong way to transition. And so just in general, making assumptions about someone's gender identity, we could very easily do away with and unlearn those things. And then sort of ensuring that you're not creating uncomfortable or awkward conversations by, for example, asking a trans person what their real name is, or asking about their medical history. And then ensuring that you're not silent when you're actually visibly witnessing queerphobia, transphobia, homophobia, and all kinds of discrimination, actually stepping up. Because I think if you're standing by, you're an active enabler. So ensuring that you're sort of like stepping up and intervening in those situations. And I mean, even education, there's so many facets to it, right? It's on an individual level as well, where you're trying to learn for your own self and taking the initiative to learn, to read up, to and to sort of like diversify your own knowledge, but at the same time ensuring that other people in the company are undergoing training, sensitivity training, speaking to other queer folk, non-binary folk, and learning from their experiences, sharing stories, case studies, and learning from real life examples and stories. And that needs to be an ongoing process, not just during specific times where you want to focus on the LGBT plus community, but that needs to be sustainable. And then obviously mentorship, engaging senior leaders, stakeholders, whoever can sort of use their platforms and use their voice, share their platform and platform others, and amplify the voices of others. We did touch upon on sort of HR policies around sort of bullying, harassment, and including trans people in policy, where there's a clear commitment to them. For example, what does, if someone were to transition at work, what sort of policies are in place, what sort of healthcare, medical amenities, or like sort of things are in offer for them. Obviously non-gendered language, and then these network groups that are beautiful in sort of like coming together. And the idea is also obviously not, yes, as we said, being an ally is one thing, but the aim is obviously to build other allies. So it's sort of bringing other people onto that journey with yourself. So it's not just this one person sort of experience. It's creating that ripple effect of solidarity and allyship, and creating that culture. And just sort of like, I mean, it's uncomfortable, right? Irrespective. It's like learning, relearning, rewiring our brains and all of that. It's always uncomfortable, but it's always needed. It's always imperative. And it's not, again, just for educating yourselves about the LGBT plus community. It's just wider. It's just in general, you need to keep expanding your worldview and sort of ensuring that what you're consuming in terms of media, news, and information isn't very narrow or skewed to a certain sort of way. And sort of, and then obviously it comes to wealth, money, right? Money, you have money. If your companies donate to trans initiatives, non-binary initiatives, fundraisers, sort of like redistribute wealth and fund initiatives, sponsorships, mentorship schemes, where you can sort of fund and bring up queer talent. But I think on a very basic level, like if someone were to do something right now today, is just like look at your social media. Who do you follow? Diversify your feed, because the way you curate your feed and the way you sort of follow things, the algorithm is like way ahead of you. So it will only show you what it wants you to see. So ensure that you're cleansing your timelines and following different people, learning from their own experiences, so that you're better informed and you're better equipped to have conversations around the LGBT plus community. Definitely. And because then what you do, obviously, how you interact with social media, how you interact with these online spaces, then obviously need to translate into real life action. So it's sort of bridging that gap as well. But these are simple things that you could do even today.
Yeah, and you're so right. It is uncomfortable, and I do kick myself every time I kind of stumble upon something like pronouns, which I think is so easy to just kind of forget that.
I sometimes make mistakes with pronouns. Sometimes I misgender people. But sort of not making a big deal of it. Just quickly say,
it's just more like, it's okay. Honestly,
Okay,
like
thank you.
it's like so long as for them, I think what I've realized is at least that effort that I'm trying
Yeah,
is sometimes enough for them to feel seen. And
absolutely.
also on the other side, for me, it's opened up a whole host of beautiful people that I've now got the privilege of knowing
Yeah,
and being part of their lives. So yeah, I think the benefits far outweigh the odd stumble or two.
absolutely.
Yeah, and you know, I'm wary of time, and I know people might be eager to ask questions. So I've just got one final question before we open the floor to comments and suggestions from the audience.
Hmm.
So my question is about the next generations, younger people. I think we can agree they're more generally more open-minded and welcoming.
Are you implying that I'm not young, Myra?
I mean, that would then mean that I'm not, and I lose
I'm
myself.
kidding. I'm kidding. Like my knees are creaking. I
You
get
are evergreen, as my mother would say. And yeah, so they're welcoming of different backgrounds and identities. It seems to me, at least, this is quite a central tenet for millennials and Gen Z or Z moving forward. So, how do you suppose ED&I should kind of grab onto this building momentum? Because to me, it seems that these are values that aren't going away. They're not going to like they'll definitely be challenged, but this is something that's here to stay. Just as you know, the whole kind of Stonewall riots movement has now stayed, and it's become a beautiful organization and voice for so many. Now, this is also momentum that we are going to we should embrace. And what can businesses and ED&I do to really platform millennials and Gen Z's perspectives? And what is the, like, to put it very bluntly and quite clearly to people, the benefits of that?
I think there's literally just one thing to do is listen to them and not discount what they have to say as a young people's thing and a fad and not sort of have that superiority complex. Just listen to them, listen to what their experiences are and bridge that gap in terms of understanding what their experiences and stories are. That's the best way to do it. And then, yeah, just listen to what they have to say, because some of them have some incredible, and the way they share stuff and explain stuff is so digestible and accessible if we just paid attention and give them the time of day. And you'd see that your own sort of understanding and worldview may change. I think it's there's nothing about there's this thing to stay or this nothing to stay. We're all constantly evolving and changing and growing, and we need to sort of pay respect to that. Obviously, respect to those who have come before us, but we need to sort of invest in the future and ensure that we're creating safe, degendered, welcoming spaces for them as they come into the workforce and the work environments, so that we're not putting them in disadvantaged positions.
Completely. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so shall we move on to questions? I've got one here ready to go. So this is from I'll read it out, Shiva, don't worry.
Yes, please.
So this is from Mark Allen. Hi Shiva, I'm Mark, pronouns are he, his, and works for the NHS. So your message is very inspiring, and they wanted to ask whether you have seen change or how change can be encouraged in those binary rigid families you mentioned across the world. We're lucky to live in a country that is more welcoming and open-minded, but how do you see global change in both families and the workplace?
Thank you for that question. It's interesting how sometimes we say the UK is a lot more welcoming and stuff, but I literally was reached out by a trans artist last week about being thrown out of the house once the family discovered that they were trans. So it really is scary sometimes that you think even in spaces that are more welcoming or generally a bit more progressive that these things still happen, because again, we need to add those nuances of cultural filters and all of that, and just trying to see who is in a better state, if anything. But yeah, I mean, first of all, obviously, if there are any issues around safety and stuff, there are loads of beautiful charities out there doing incredible work. Transactual UK, Mermaids UK, Gendered Intelligence, UK Black Pride, Nazamat Foundation. These are just some of the off the top of my head that are doing incredible work. If anyone needs any resource and information or direction to it, anyone. But in terms of usualizing, I wouldn't say normalizing, usualizing sort of queer identities within families and everything, I think it starts right at the basic level of education. So even in kids' schools and curriculum, we need to do away with the sort of heteronormative, nuclear, idealistic family that people sort of put on a pedestal. We need imageries where kids, the curriculum in itself is expansive, and there are imageries of different kinds of families, different setups of families, just different structures of families, right at the very early onset of a child's upbringing, so that they're exposed to those sort of narratives and imageries, and it sort of utilizes it and makes it very much part of their lifestyle. But in terms of bridging the gaps with people who are obviously completely sort of like averse to queer kids and queer folk, obviously safety first, the kids need to be looked after, but it's sort of trying to see where can a dialogue happen, because again, hatred is learned. It's something that we need to deconstruct, and it's something that can be deconstructed. It's trying to see what the best approach is within that specific context, and depending on what that context is, it's, if for example it's religion, there are specific organizations that can help with introducing families who are potentially homophobic to families who aren't, and share experience, lessons learned, and experiences of how they have navigated their religion and how they can help others. So it's sort of depending on what exactly is the basis on which people discriminate, and then addressing that. For example, for my own family, it was religion. And so I was trying to understand what aspects of religion did they see as an excuse to discriminate, and deconstruct that. But it was more about their perception of the religion rather than the actual religion and what it says. So sometimes it's trying to address and understand where people come from, because it's very easy to dismiss people. Obviously, sometimes you have to protect yourself and remove yourself from any harmful situation. But if you have the capacity and the ability to engage people in dialogue, there's a lot of difference to be made.
Completely. And, like you said, giving people that exposure is just so important.
Yes.
To identify and realize that we are really...
Sometimes people just want to see a template, just a reference point, and learn from that, because sometimes they don't have that and they aren't exposed to it. They don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the access to resources. So it's sort of trying to see in what way they can be directed.
Completely. So this kind of nicely moves on to the next question. So this is from David. Hi, Shiva. At what stage in your life did you know you were non-binary? What age? How did you share this with your family, and how did they embrace it?
Wow, that's a tough one.
What, this just reminds me of your nanny, who I've
seen. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so I knew I wasn't straight, or didn't sort of fit into that heteronormative idea of what a man or boy is at a very young age. I was probably like 5, 6. And this was the same time where I started exploring dance as an art form through my grandma, as Myra has mentioned. And my grandma was a dancer herself. And she was a huge champion of people taking up the arts and practicing it. And within dance, I used to play with gender a lot. So I used to wear my grandma's skirts and makeup and jewelry and play around with that. Back in the day, because I think, again, Bollywood music and dance, it's inherently very queer, but then you're only allowed to experiment within the performance space. And as soon as you're out of that, you need to be back into sort of that heteronormative lifestyle. So you're only allowed to explore within that space, which is why I was like, I like this space. I'm going to spend more time within this art space. And through dance over the years, I was able to sort of explore my gender identity and expression, but I did not. Again, I think coming out is a very Western concept, but when I told my mum that I was queer was when I was 20, 23, 24. So very recently, in fact. Didn't go down very well. It took almost a year for her to truly understand and come on board. And bless her, she's a huge champion right now. But back when I first shared that with her, it was months of crying, months of trying to fix me and that sort of stuff. So again, it speaks to sort of the regressive conditionings that she was brought up with. So it was sort of me allowing room for that as well. And obviously giving her room to make peace with stuff and sort of come on board, because obviously she has grown up with her own perceptions and ideals of what her child would be like. So it's sort of not trying to expect that she would immediately sort of be this massive ally. So it's trying to, I mean, it was a journey for me. It was definitely going to be a journey for her. So it's been a journey for all of us. But touch wood, thankfully, we are in a much better space. Some family members aren't very much on the same page. But at the end of the day, it all that matters if you've got some form of support, whether that's through biological family or chosen family. As long as you have a support system, it does not truly matter what that support system looks like.
Yeah, brilliant. And I actually got a question from our founder. So she'd like, yeah, I know. It actually asks, how have you found your experience of being non-binary as you have lived across various regions around the world? And you mentioned earlier about your, I think you said trans identifying friend who found it quite difficult coming out.
Yeah.
So, is the UK more of an inclusive culture, and how is it compared for you living in these different regions of the world?
It's hard to sort of because again, those experiences are very subjective because they're specific to me, and so it would vastly differ for other people. Personally speaking, it varies. It really depends on the context, because I have faced public violent discrimination here, where I've even had to get police involved and stuff. So it has been quite volatile here. But at the same time, I think it's part of you've got legislation and then you've got societal sort of perceptions and behavior, right? So it's sort of trying to see, while the legislation may protect me here, sometimes society doesn't look after me. In India, the legislation may not protect me, but sometimes society is more inclusive because gender variance and gender expansive sort of narratives have existed for ages in India. And so it really depends on the context and the environment and the circle of people that you're surrounded with, that you just never know sometimes where you could be safe or not.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I didn't even consider the kind of legislation and the society perspective, but it's so true. And for example, India, I'm aware that there is actually a third gender in Hinduism, and that's what's given people the room and space to identify with being a trans woman or a trans man or non-binary.
It's even legislatively, they're legally allowed to identify a third gender category.
Yeah, and to me that's fascinating, because when I read about India otherwise, it's not exactly the most accommodating place when it comes to women's rights and stuff, but progress.
Nuance,
yeah. And so I have one more question from Dylan Schumann. With Pride Month, we see a great deal of performative allyship. What is your advice to organizations to ensure their approach is intentional and authentic? I think it's a brilliant question, because last year I remember how, seeing as Pride moved online, so many places just that visibility they decided it wasn't needed.
It wasn't needed because there's no place to market themselves and sort of capitalize off pink washing and stuff. But 100%.
Thank you, Dylan. Yeah.
Performative allyship is very much on the rise. People are very quick to slap on a rainbow flag on all of their logos across every platform, but actually don't follow through with being proper LGBT plus allies all year round. And so it's very easy to spot people who don't have that sort of right intentions. Take it, for example, we're talking about Pride Month, right? If someone has a campaign, how has the campaign been designed? Who does the campaign cater to? Who was involved in creating the campaign? Does the campaign benefit the community with monetary donations and stuff? So there are so many facets and pointers that you can identify in terms of performative allyship. And what we need is to just do away with all of that and ensure that allyship is all year round, sustainable, and LGBT plus people are looked after not just for optics on the outside, but for actual day-to-day workings within the organization.
And are there any particular examples of companies that have been very good at having an all-year presence or visibility and, you know, that ingrained? Because to me, it sounds like that's not something that can be protected through policy,
yeah,
and guidelines. But
I think,
yeah, on the advertising side, is there much that you've seen?
So one example I really like is, so Netflix as a company have a separate social media account dedicated to LGBT plus content that is constantly throughout the year sharing content and sharing initiatives and stuff. So you can tell very much so that they care about their LGBT plus community, both on screen and off screen. That's just one example, but you can see the lengths to which an organization can go to ensure there are dedicated measures and spaces for diverse voices. So that's one example where it is all year round. It is an ongoing effort and commitment.
Completely. And you know, I think we'll end with one of my own questions for you, Shiva, because I clearly haven't asked enough. It's more about how you see the next few years shaping up in terms of LGBTQ rights. Because right now, you might have heard yourself about how Stonewall is having is kind of caught up in a conversation about trans rights. And, you know, to me, it seems quite ironic, seeing as, you know, one of the people who first started the Stonewall riots were trans women. You know, Marsha P. Johnson, these are iconic women who, you know, were there from the very beginning. And then now we're at a place where we're having this conversation of whether Stonewall should be inclusive of trans.
Absolutely a mess. And I think everyone needs to take a very strong vocal stance in support of the trans community. That's the only thing that we can do. We need to support organizations like Stonewall that are doing great trans inclusive work and committing to it. And so we need to stand by them. Organizations like even Mermaids and stuff, we really need to step up for our trans siblings, because trans liberation means liberation for all. And that's the only way forward.
Completely. Well, I think that really beautifully brings our fireside chat to an end, Shiva. I just really want to thank you for joining us today, Shiva. It's honestly been so wonderful hearing from you. You bring this radiance and happiness to all the conversations and such wholesomeness.
Thank you.
And I thank you for all your brilliant work to date, advocating for the community, and I can't wait to get back to the dance studio with you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I was wondering whether you would like to actually also promote your work. So Queer Parivar and your Netflix documentary, like where can people find this information and how can they approach you if they would like to get in touch?
I'm most accessible through my Instagram. It's Shiva Raichandani, just my full name, and you'll find just all my work there. And if you prefer websites, it's shivaraichandani.com. But yes, my main platform is Instagram, and I'd love to connect with as many of you as possible there. So thank you. Thank you again for having me. Thank you, Maria, for this beautiful opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure being in your company.
Pleasure is all mine. I just want to end on a last note, just about, as we mentioned, governments are flying the Pride flag this month, and it's important to be mindful of the systematic lack of support for queer people and the violent campaigns against trans people, particularly trans women of colour. Pride is a celebration of self and community, but it is also a protest. Thank you all for joining us, and I hand the floor back to the Equality Leaders team. Thank you.